So welcome, everyone. I'm Angela Ung, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and we're delighted to welcome you to the 75th episode of the Clements Bookworm. Just in case you're joining us for the first time, we really do try to use the chat quite a bit. Feel free to chime in, just change the setting to everyone. And in the chat, you'll see my colleague Ann Bennington-Helber providing helpful information and monitoring anything that's any discussions happening there. However, if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A section. That keeps them together so they don't get lost. And it also gives you a chance to see what everyone else is asking, and you can give it a thumbs up, which will send those questions to the top of the queue. We do have the live machine captions turned on as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program. So you can toggle those on or off. You can change the size of the font. So please go ahead and do that and play around with your screen a little bit so that you can see the speakers as well as the slides in the best possible way. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to about 1900. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. Okay. If you haven't yet answered the poll question, click very quickly. And I'm going to end it and share the results. So we asked a couple of questions to see what you might already know about this topic in preparation, just to think through today's conversation. And so what was the first state to have profit-driven prisons? And as we suspected, most people don't expect the answer to be New York. So we'll hear more about that from Robin in a little while. And then today, what everyday objects are made by people in prison? And it's actually all of them. So we made it multiple choice so that you could select as many as you thought, but we didn't want to give it away by saying all of the above. And so license plates, hand sanitizer, flags, cheese, and eyeglasses are among the many items that are still made by prisoners today. Okay, and now I am delighted to introduce our guests who are joining us as part of the Clements Library's celebration of the work of Martin Luther King Jr. Inspired by King's speech accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, the University of Michigan has chosen as this year's theme, Restless Dissatisfaction, an urgent call for the pursuit of justice and equality. And so joining us, we have LaKisha Michelle Simmons as the Associate Professor of History and Women's and Gender Studies, Arthur F. Thurnow Professor here at the University of Michigan. Simmons is the author of the award-winning Crescent City Girls, The Lives of Young Black Women in Segregated New Orleans, and she is also the co-editor of the Global History of Black Girlhood. Professor Simmons is working on a new book on the history of Black motherhood, which explores histories of love and loss in Black families during the 19th century. So LaKisha will be in conversation with today's featured author, Robin Bernstein, who is a cultural historian focusing on race and performance from the 19th century to the present. She is the author of Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit, as well as Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights, which won 5 awards. Currently the chair of the program in American Studies, Bernstein teaches in the Department of African and African American Studies and the program in Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard University. So welcome to both of you. And Robin, I'm delighted to turn it over to you to talk more about your amazing book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I want to thank Angela and Anne for inviting me in. And I want to thank Professor LaKisha Simmons for not only being in conversation with me, which I'm very excited about, but also for her brilliant work over decades. And if you have not yet read LaKisha Simmons's historical work about Black girls in the 20th and 19th centuries, I urge you to read her work. It is spectacular and brilliant and wonderful. So thank you, LaKisha, for being in conversation with me today. And I also want to thank the Clements Library for not only inviting me today, but also for contributing to the research in this book, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. So let me start by giving you a little bit of the overview of the book and what's at stake in Freeman's Challenge. So the basic, what the book is really about is how prison for profit, profit-driven incarceration began in the North, not the South. The answer to the poll that we posted just a moment ago is New York. Profit-driven incarceration in the United States began in New York State, which is a big surprise to a lot of people. And it began long before the Civil War, about 50 years before the Civil War. Now, we have an idea, there's a very popular narrative that profit-driven incarceration was, quote, slavery by another name, that it was invented by the South after the Civil War in order to re-enslave African Americans. And this kind of story often links to the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which outlawed forced servitude, quote, except as a punishment for crime. So in the view of a lot of people, that created a new form of slavery after the end of chattel slavery in the South. Now, there is a lot that's right about the story that I just told you, but there are a couple things that are wrong with it. The main thing that's right is that profit-driven incarceration, things like convict leasing, the forcing of prisoners to work in a private company for the benefit of the private company, that was slavery by another name, and it arguably still is slavery by another name. It did come about in the wake of slavery, but it came about in the wake of Northern slavery, not Southern slavery. And because slavery in the North, specifically New York State, ended half a century before slavery in the South ended, in fact, profit-driven incarceration emerged half a century before the Civil War in the North. So that's the story that I'm telling in this book. Now, the problem with starting the story with the South and the Civil War, which is how most other people do it, the problem with starting the story then is that if we do that, we're starting the story in the middle. And when we start the story in the middle, we're inadvertently letting the North off the hook. What I wanted to do in Freeman's Challenge was put the North back on the hook. I wanted to tell the story of Northern profit-driven incarceration. And I wanted to tell it in a way that was so vivid that nobody would ever forget it. And so I decided to tell the story through one person. And that one person is William Freeman. If I could have the next slide, please. Yes, so here is William Freeman, and here is the Clements Library. This is the best portrait we have of William Freeman, and I am very happy to say that it came from the Clements Library, and this is extremely rare. I have not been able to find this image anywhere else. It was published in a special issue of a newspaper, so not in its usual sequence. It was an out-of-sequence additional printing. And as far as I'm aware, it does not exist anywhere except in the Clements Library. So I'm very grateful to the Clements for this image. So let me tell you a little bit about William Freeman and what made him so important. William Freeman was born in Auburn, New York. Auburn it's in central New York State. It's in the Finger Lakes area. And it happens to be the birthplace of the very first prison for profit. But William Freeman was just born there by coincidence. He grew up in the Black community in Auburn. He was both African American and Native American. And if I could have the next slide, please. He grew up in a neighborhood in Auburn that was called New Guinea. And you can see right here on this map, there's New Guinea. This was the Black neighborhood of Auburn, New York. And it was actually established by William Freeman's grandparents, who were enslaved, and their names were Harry and Kate. And they were forced to come to Auburn, and they were forced to start building white Auburn. But as they did it, they also built Black Auburn. So they established this community, and this is where William Freeman grew up. He grew up as part of a vibrant Black community. It was a community that was on the rise and that was extremely close-knit. And because of who his grandparents were, he was part of the most prominent Black family in town. So he was well known by everybody. And in some ways, his life was very hard, but in other ways, his life was very good. And he had a livable life. But all of that changed in 1840. In 1840, William Freeman was accused of stealing a horse. There was no hard evidence against him, but it didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. Next slide, please. This is the Auburn State Prison, and this was the very first prison for profit in the United States. And when I say prison for profit, what I mean is that it was a prison that was established for the purpose of creating profit. So I want to backtrack just a little bit and talk about the establishment of this prison. So the way this prison was established was that in 1816, New York State was looking for a location in which to build a second prison. There was already one prison in New York. It was in Greenwich Village in New York City. And it was overcrowded. So the state wanted to build a new prison. And they wanted to build it for the same reasons that other prisons existed in the United States and also elsewhere. At the time, this was 1816, prisons existed for some combination of 3 reasons. They existed either to punish and or to control people, that is basically to get people off the street, and or to reform people, to help people live better lives. So punishment, control, reformation, these were the goals of prisons at the time. But a group of white businessmen in Auburn, New York, had a radical new idea. This new idea was that if they got the state contract to build the prison, they would immediately get $20,000. The purpose of that $20,000 was simply to build the physical plant. But what they realized was that Auburn was a tiny little village. It only had about 2,000 people. And $20,000 in 1816 is the equivalent of about $500,000 today. And they put two and two together and they realized that if you take a little village of 2,000 people and you flood it with the equivalent of $500,000, that is going to completely transform the economy. Now, that's really obvious to us, but at the time, that was a radical insight. And then, of course, more money was going to be coming every year forever. So what they realized was that basically this would help Auburn grow from a village into a city. And then they had a second idea. And this again was another radical idea that these white businessmen in Auburn had. Their second radical idea was to build factories right into the prison. And you can see those factories in this map from 1851. They built the prison by the banks of a river. You can see the river in that map. They built a dam, and they got the state to pay for that dam, by the way. You can see the dam in the river. The purpose of the dam was to provide water power for in-prison factories. So the concept from the beginning, actually from before the beginning, before the prison was even built, the concept was that the prisoners would be forced to work in factories, manufacturing consumer goods. And those goods came to be sold throughout New York State and in some cases throughout the Northeast at a profit for private prisons. The prisoners made no money at all. They did not receive any wages. Meanwhile, so the prison was taking money from two different directions. They were taking money from the state, and then they were taking labor from the prisoners, and then they were taking money from private companies in exchange for the prisoners' labor. So this was three different streams of value coming into the state prison. And this was a radical new idea for what a prison should be for. The radical new idea was that the primary purpose of a prison was not to punish, not to control people, and not to reform people, but instead to stimulate a local economy. In short, to make profit. So this was the prison in which William Freeman served, starting from when he was 15 years old. And I can show you the particular factory in which he worked. If you look at the word state in state prison, if you look right above the S, you'll see Haim shop. Haims are animal harnesses. And that's where William Freeman was forced to work for 12 hours a day for 5 years. If I could have the next slide, please. This is a view of the Auburn State Prison from the outside, and I love showing this image because it shows, first of all, just how big the prison was. You can see the trees for scale. The prison still exists. I'll talk about that in a moment, and it is tremendous. It is huge. I have walked around, I've been inside the prison several times, and I've also walked around the perimeter, and I'm a fast walker. I'm from New York City. I walk fast, and it took me 40 minutes, 40 minutes, to walk around the exterior of the prison. This thing is huge. And this image from 1869 gives us an idea of just how big it was, what a behemoth it was. And I also really value this image because it shows that the prison looked like a factory, which in fact is what it is. And if you look at those smokestacks, each one of those smokestacks marks the location of a factory where prisoners were being forced to work to manufacture consumer goods for the profit of private companies. So this is what William Freeman entered when he was 15 years old. And William Freeman resisted. William Freeman fought back against the system of prison for profit. He had been free his entire life. His grandparents, as I said, had been enslaved. His father had been enslaved but had become free. And his mother had always been free. And here he was thrown into this prison for a crime he said he did not commit. And he was told, "You are now, quote, a slave of the state." William Freeman was furious and he resisted. He resisted while he was in the prison, and we can talk about how he did that. And then after he was released, when he was 20 years old, he resisted first legally. He tried to gain a legal case against the prison to recover what he saw as wages that he was due. From his perspective, his wages had been stolen from him and he wanted to recover them. And then for 6 months, he tried legal means to recover his lost wages, and he was laughed at and he was dismissed. And after 6 months, he turned to violence, and William Freeman committed a murder. Now, when I say that, I'm not giving anything away in the book. It's right there in the title of the book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. He did commit a serious crime in order to challenge the prison. And then there was a major trial. So next slide, please. The trial got very famous very fast, and it wasn't only because there was a murder, because let's face it, there are lots of murders. It wasn't unique because of the murder. It got a lot of publicity very fast, in part because the defense and the prosecutor were both celebrities. William Henry Seward was the two-time governor of New York State, and the prosecutor, John Van Buren, was the son of President Martin Van Buren. Now, what they both did, the defense and the prosecution, they actually collaborated to silence William Freeman's challenge to the prison. What's really important to understand is that the original strategy of the prison's founders was to grow their village into a city, and it worked. And as a result, Auburn became a kind of one company town where everybody, it didn't matter who you were, everybody was economically connected directly or indirectly to the prison. And that was absolutely true of both William Henry Seward and John Van Buren. And by the way, I'm sure many of you recognize William Henry Seward because he later served as the Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln, and he brokered the purchase of Alaska. So, but they were both economically tied to the prison and also politically tied to the prison. So they were both invested in silencing William Freeman, and they did it in different ways. The trial got very big. It was called the Trial of the Half Century. It generated over 1 million words of print nationally. And it was very spectacular. And I talk about that a lot in the book. If I could have the next slide, please. What also happened as a result in the wake of William Freeman's crime and his spectacular trial was that Auburn actually became a center for abolition. It had already been a spot on the Underground Railroad, but shortly after William Freeman's trial, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and later Harriet Tubman came to Auburn. Douglass came to lecture, and later he came to publish in Auburn. And Harriet Tubman, of course, came to live. She settled her family there. And she, of course, published and continued her activism from Auburn. So this is an unexpected kind of coming together that happened in the wake of Freeman's challenge. Next slide, please. And I'm happy to talk about any of these things at greater length. The Auburn prison still exists today. It's now called the Auburn Correctional Facility, and 100% of all New York State license plates are manufactured in Auburn. No other prison in New York State manufactures license plates. So if you have ever seen or touched a New York State license plate, you have seen or touched an object that was made by a man who was literally walking in William Freeman's footsteps. Last slide, please. There is a movement afoot to end the practice of exploitative prison labor in New York State. And I want to be very clear that the two bills that I've put up here would not end labor in New York State prisons. There are a lot of good reasons that people who are incarcerated want to work. They want to work for a lot of the same reasons that people who are not incarcerated want to work. So nothing is outlawing prison labor. But the goal of these bills is, first of all, to outlaw coerced or forced prison labor. And the second one on the screen there is the purpose of it is to ensure that for prisoners who choose to work, they have safe and fair working conditions and reasonable wages. So these are things that I can talk about later on in the conversation if people are interested. These are movements that I'm involved with today. So I thank you all so much, and I'm looking forward to talking with Professor LaKisha Simmons and everyone who came today about William Freeman and his challenge to the original prison for profit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robin. I just want to
I
say
just want to say
how happy I am to be in conversation with you and to have the opportunity to learn from your work. I feel really grateful. And also, you're not only an incredible researcher, but a beautiful writer. And this book tells an incredible story. So I was just thinking about that, the way that you tell the story. And in your presentation, you tell us about the kind of founding of prison for profit. And I imagine that there was probably a lot of ways that you could have chosen to tell that story. And so my question for you is, what is the first thing that drew you to William Freeman and to use him to tell this story?
Yeah, thank you so much. I stumbled across William Freeman's story. For a long time, I've been interested in issues of race and the idea of innocence. That was the topic of my first book. So I was continuing down that road, and I was interested in the criminalization of Black children, and I was looking to understand when that started. The common story is that that started in the final quarter of the 19th century, but I had a feeling that wasn't right. I had a feeling it was earlier. And so I went looking, and as I kept looking backwards and backwards, deeper and deeper into the past, I stumbled across William Freeman. And the way I stumbled across him was in a footnote. I found a footnote that referred to a theatrical production that depicted a Black man committing violence against white people. And when I saw that, and that was 1846, was that theatrical production. And when I saw that in a footnote, I went, what? That doesn't make any sense. And the reason it doesn't make any sense, I have one of my areas of knowledge is theater history. And I knew that in the mid-19th century, white audiences absolutely did not want to see representations of Black on white violence. It was too frightening to be subsumed under entertainment. And so the idea that white audiences in Auburn, New York would line up and pay money to watch Black on white violence, I knew was very strange. And at first I thought, honestly, I thought the footnote must be in error. And I started checking it out, double checking it to see if it was true. And in fact, it was true. And then I thought, okay, wow. Because I knew just how unusual this was, I realized that something race shaking must have happened in Auburn in 1846. And I thought, what could it be? And so I started, pulling on the threads and going down the rabbit hole. And the person who was depicted on stage was William Freeman, who I had never heard of. And I started learning who he was, what he was all about. And as I read more and more, I slowly came to realize he had been dismissed as quote unquote a lunatic. William Henry Seward used the insanity defense to defend him, basically said that what he was saying was just completely insane and irrational. And the more I read, the more I thought, no, I mean, this person has been impaired by 5 years of abuse in the Auburn State Prison. This person has absolutely been damaged and hurt, but he is saying something that is completely rational, which is that it is wrong to steal people's labor and that the state owed him wages for his work. Whether one agrees with that or disagrees with that, that is a rational claim. And the more deeply I dug into it, and the more I realized that he had said something that was A, rational, and B, extremely important, the more I realized that I had to keep writing about this person.
That's amazing. And I feel like there's probably 10 questions I could ask you right now. I'm gonna maybe start with the question about childhood and age, because you said you were thinking about the criminalization of Black children. And in his story, he gets caught up in the so-called justice system pretty young. And so I wonder how you were thinking about his age at that time. I think he was a teenager. Did you see
Yeah.
him as a child? Did society see him as a child?
Yeah, yeah, it was really important, and of course, this is one of our shared interests. So I'm delighted that you asked me this question. Um, it's complicated. That's the quick answer. He was 15 when he went into the Auburn State Prison. He was clearly at that point thought of as a child, as a boy. And when he left the Auburn State Prison, he was 20. And what is clear to me, although he never said it in this many words, but it was clear to me that he thought of himself as a man, which is not surprising because, frankly, every 20-year-old I know thinks of themselves as an adult. So it's really not so surprising that he would think of himself that way. I see him as a very young person. And so was he a child? Is a 15-year-old a child? Is a 20-year-old a child? He was definitely a young person. And childhood actually became really important in his trial. And I wrote about this some. I didn't write about it nearly as much as I wanted to. Um, so one of the points that the prosecution and the defense disagreed about was whether William Freeman changed while he was in prison. The prosecution argued that he had not changed, that he had always been a violent person. He had gone in as a violent person and he had come out as a violent person. Whereas the defense argued that he became violent while he was in the Auburn State Prison, that he changed. So, in order to bring in evidence about whether he did or did not change, both the prosecution and the defense had to call up witnesses who knew William Freeman before he went into prison, which is to say, to knew him as a child. So there were, if I recall correctly, there were 163 witnesses. Like I said, this was a big trial. It took weeks. And of these 163 witnesses, a lot of them were describing William Freeman when he was 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, when he was very clearly a child. And they were describing what he was like. And those descriptions, of course, conflicted with each other. But when we put them all together, we can get a lot of information about who he was when he was a child. So, for me, I was thinking of William Freeman as an 8-year-old, as a 15-year-old, as a 20-year-old, and beyond. I was thinking of him at all of these ages at once, but also at all of these ages sequentially.
That's so interesting for me. And to think about those ages of 15 to 20 when he was in prison also makes you think about how formative those years are and what it means to be incarcerated at those ages and the kind of experiences he would have had that you detail in the book, based on the prison's methods of treatment. Um, it's really powerful to think about it in terms of his age and stage of developing, um, and what we know now, at least about cognitively about people during those ages. Going off of that, I want to ask you, a big part of the book is about um, various ways of various types of disability, right? So he struggled with some disabilities in terms of his health coming out of prison. And then there was also the question in his trial, as you mentioned, about whether or not he was insane. And then I think layered on top of that, there's the experiences that you detail that he went through when he was in prison from 15 to 20 that surely caused some mental health struggles. So my question is really about, one, how you thought about talking about disability in the book and framing that for your reader. And then two, maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you think we should be thinking about incarceration and mental health, what this story can teach us.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, William Freeman had multiple disabilities, and let me be clear that he had none when he went into the prison. He went into the prison as a healthy, typical bodied person. And then several things happened to him while he was in prison. So one, I did not earlier detail the specifics of how incarceration in Auburn worked beyond just the working, but let me just pause and give a little bit more detail about some of the hallmarks of the Auburn State Prison. One was that there was extreme social control and extreme violence. So when you think about it, if you want to get people to work for no benefit whatsoever, no wages, no early release, no special privileges, nothing, that's actually a really hard thing to do, to get people to work under those circumstances. And so the only way you can really do it is through violence and extreme social control. And that's exactly what the prison did. So this extreme social control was enacted in two ways. One was by putting 100% of the prisoners into solitary confinement every single night. And the purpose of the solitary confinement was not to punish. And this is very counterintuitive. The purpose of the solitary confinement was to prevent people from talking to each other, so to prevent worker solidarity. And that was explicit, by the way. That was the reason the solitary confinement was enacted. And so they were put into solitary confinement every night. Solitary confinement, let us be very clear, is torture, and solitary confinement causes mental health problems. And it did that for William Freeman. During the day, prisoners were marched out of their cells and forced into these factories like the ones I showed you. And while they were in the factories, they were working together, but they were not allowed to speak at all, ever. And it's really hard to take that in. Like, let's just pause and take that in. They were not allowed to speak at all, ever. Not in the factories, not at meal times, not while they were marching, never. So one of the things that really breaks my heart in this book, when I think about it, is when William Freeman entered the prison at the age of 15 and he was told this rule, he was basically told, you are not going to speak another word until you're 20. And just trying to take that in, it's so overwhelming. It's so unimaginable. And William Freeman did speak. William Freeman resisted his incarceration from the beginning, specifically resisted his work, and he spoke up and he said that he did not want to work because he had not committed any crime, and also because he did not want to work, as he put it, for nothing, for no pay. And there was terrible retribution against him. He was beaten. He was waterboarded, believe it or not. The Auburn State Prison invented a new form of waterboarding. And in one of the most terrible cases, a guard beat him with a board and beat him so badly that he became deaf. So these are the two forms of disability that he emerged with. He emerged with mental health problems that were surely caused both by the beating, his skull was broken, but also by the constant torture of 5 years of forced solitary confinement every night, as well as many other forms of violence. And he was almost completely deaf. So to get back to your question about how I thought about disability, I thought about it more in the form of maiming. The word that I found more useful for me in thinking about what I saw in William Freeman than disability was maiming, that the state had what Jesbir Puar calls the right to maim. And it had the right to maim him, and it did, and it maimed him in multiple ways. He thought of himself as an impaired person in terms of his deafness. He talked about his deafness and the difficulty it created in his life. He did not ever, in ways that have made it into the historical record, he never spoke about his mental impairments. And it was never clear to me to what extent he understood that he had some mental impairments. So just to give some examples, when he first came out of the prison, before he went into the prison, he had the ability to read. He had the ability to do calculation. When he first came out of the prison, he had pretty much lost that. He seemed to regain later the ability to calculate, but not to read. And he came out and started drinking heavily. That did not begin in the prison. But his family and his friends all commented on how he had changed mentally, how he seemed dull is the way they put it, and how he didn't talk to them in a normal way anymore, which is not at all surprising given what he experienced. So yeah, so I thought about it more in terms of maiming than in terms of disability and his struggle to deal with his changed body.
It seems really important to frame it in the way you said the state has the right to maim, and to frame it in the way where the prison is creating these physical and mental conditions on the people inside. Um, that seems like a really important intervention. I don't know if I've told you this before, but when I think about his story, I think a lot about traumatic brain injury or CTE, or some of the ways in which that can really affect you on multiple levels. So I know we're not supposed to diagnose people in the past, especially because we're not doctors, but it's hard not to think about those things.
Yeah. Well, what we know for sure is that he sustained a brain injury. We know that for sure. And whether it qualifies as a TBI, a traumatic brain injury in the contemporary medical sense, that I couldn't say. But his brain was injured. There's no question.
Mhm. Um, I want to ask a question about slavery and incarceration. Um, Freeman, he was like a generation. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here. It's complicated, I know, in New York State because of gradual abolition, but a generation removed from slavery in a way in his community. I mean, the remnants of enslavement in New York State were still around him um, when he was a kid. And so I wonder about the growth of this prison in conversation with what does slavery mean? What does the end of slavery in New York State mean? And the continued enslavement of African Americans in the South mean? And growing abolition movement in the North and discussion of free labor in the North mean when this prison is just growing and growing in a weird kind of likeness to slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So that's an incredibly important story in this book. Gradual emancipation in New York State, some of the big dates are 1799 is when the most important wave of gradual emancipation began. And that wave of gradual emancipation freed nobody. What it did was make the children of enslaved people free. So, and then there were additional laws along the way. And the children who were born technically free, they were actually indentured to the enslavers of their mother. So nobody was really free for a long time. I mean, except people who had always been free, like William Freeman's mother, for example, had always been free. So slavery officially ended in New York State in 1827. William Freeman was born in 1824. So when William Freeman was born, there were still enslaved people in New York State and, in fact, in his own family. And then long beyond slavery in New York, there was still slavery-based indentured servitude. So these babies who had been born of enslaved mothers, they continued to be enslaved, to be indentured, basically have their work forced out of them for decades after, and that went on until 1848. So Freeman was in a world that an immediate world where there were enslaved people and indentured Black people all around him. And this was really important. The New York State was in the process of transitioning from a slavery-based economy to a state capitalism-based economy. And the prison was a huge part of that. So the prison was part of an emerging social economy where what state capitalism means is that the state understands one of its primary responsibilities to be to stimulate the economy. And the prison became a way to stimulate the economy. So this was absolutely part of the story of slavery in New York State.
Mm. And so the prisoners were both Black and white, and maybe Native American as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder about when we're thinking about the rise of the prison in relationship to slavery, how does that play into the story?
Yeah. So this is really interesting. Um, the very first group of prisoners in the Auburn State Prison, this would have been in 1816, as far as I have been able to determine, they were all white, 100% of them. So again, this is not a simplistic prison replacing slavery. These were all white men, by the way. They were all men who were originally incarcerated in the Auburn State Prison. And the purpose of the prison was not originally a racist purpose. It was not originally a racist agenda. What it was a capitalist agenda. The purpose was to extract labor from prisoners of any color and to extract money from the state and to grow Auburn from a village into a city. That was the goal. So it was not a racial agenda originally, but I emphasize the word originally. So once this object, the prison, once this system existed, and it was all originally white prisoners, didn't stay that way. And that's pretty predictable, I think. So once it existed, although it was not instituted for racist purposes, once it existed, then it was available for racist purposes. And that's exactly what happened. So the prison became gradually more and more Black. By the time William Freeman was incarcerated, starting in 1840, the prison was about 9% Black. It was 1 in 11 prisoners was Black. And to put that in perspective, at the time, New York State was about 2% Black. So Black people were overrepresented in the prison by 1840, more than fourfold. And now, today, prisoners in New York State are approximately 75% Black and brown. So this is, to me, this is really interesting and important that you had this institution that was not racist in its original goal, in its original vision, but the minute it existed, it became usable in a racist agenda, and that's exactly what has happened.
It kind of loops back to your first answer about the criminalization of Black children, because it the criminalization of Black children becomes useful because it helps fill up this prison with workers.
Yeah.
And the ways in which we know historically Black children get caught up, whether it's for a crime they say they didn't commit or just standing on the corner um, in the 19th century, right? That they could get pulled into these institutions because they needed the bodies. Um, okay, I want to ask a question about your research process and your journey into the archives. Because I know you and I know a little bit of the history of this book, I know that you did so much research and you found so many documents related to this case and really explored everything that you could. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience in the archives. And then maybe the last question that I'll ask you after you do that is if you can, because I know you collected so much, if you could say a little bit about what you had to leave out, and
Oh, sure.
if you had if you could add another chapter and make the book super long, what would it have been about?
Sure. Oh, thank you so much. And then also, I noticed there are some really good questions in the Q&A, so I want to make sure we get to some of those. So the research process, I did massive research both online and in brick and mortar archives. I worked with a lot of archives in New York State. The county historian in Auburn, New York was fantastic. So there was a lot of brick and mortar, there was a lot of online, and then there was a lot of remote. So for example, I found that image at the Clements Library. I found it online. I found the listing online, and then I communicated with Paul Erickson, who has been a friend for many years, about that document, and he was able to send me a PDF of it, or not a PDF, excuse me, a very high quality image of it. So I've still never held it in my hands, and I'm going to be coming to Michigan in the spring, and I would love to go to the Clements and actually hold that amazing document in my hands. So it was that. So that was the research process basically. I also went to the Auburn prison today, and I spoke with men who are incarcerated there today. And I spoke with them both before and after the book was published. And that was really powerful and amazing. We talked about how their experience was similar and dissimilar from William Freeman's. And then what I had to leave out, oh, I left out so much. The book is really short. I wanted to write a short book. The entire book is under 200 pages and it has about 50 images. So it's a really short book. So I left out a lot because I wanted the book to read like a novel. Every single word in the book is true. I made up nothing. If I say somebody had blue eyes, they had blue eyes. I mean, it's an absolutely fact-based book. But I wanted it to read like a novel. I wanted it to read in a way that nobody would be able to put it down. I wanted people to care about William Freeman as much as I cared about him. And so I left out 95% of everything. One thing that I left out, I'll just give one example. There's a really powerful scene in the book where William Freeman goes to a magistrate named Bostwick, and he's asking Bostwick to help him launch a legal case against the Auburn State Prison. And one thing that I knew, and I did not include in the book, was that something like 4 days earlier, William Bostwick had been involved in surveying land that had been seized from the Cayuga Nation, the local Native Americans, and that the displacement and the genocide of the Cayugas is a really important part of the book. And I actually opened the book with a kind of land acknowledgement that everything in the book happens because of the genocide against the Cayuga Nation. And so 4 days before William Freeman and Bostwick spoke, Bostwick was surveying land that had been recently seized from the Cayugas, and he actually drew a map, and I have that map. And it's amazing, but it wasn't a factor in their conversation, and so I had to leave it out. And that's just one example of some of the amazing things I had to leave out.
Thank you so much. It's beautifully written. And I think we should probably note here that William Freeman was Black and Native American.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
okay, I'll end my questions there so we have time for the wonderful questions in the queue.
Thank you so much, LaKisha. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, this has been an amazing morning for sure. And I'm just putting this slide back up one more time. And just as a reminder, we will send everyone a copy of the a link to the recording and any of the resources and the discount code in an email later today. Very quickly before we go on to the Q&A, and if anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A. I want to announce that our latest exhibit is now available to visit in person Monday through Friday from noon to 4. The exhibition is More Than Gray, Reimagining America in Full Color, and it's really fantastic. It illuminates the brighter side of history, spotlighting all the color and vibrancy that are often concealed by the gray and sepia tones of pre-1900 American imagery. And I just want to mention that the Office of Academic Multicultural Initiatives has more amazing programming coming up. And so there's programming throughout the month of January. And on Monday, the keynote lecture will take place both in person and online. And Anne is sharing the link for that in the chat so you can get more information. We have some guided tours coming up, and the next tour is on Friday, January 25th Friday, January 24th in 2025 at 4 p.m. So if you're in the area, we're always excited to see you. And of course, February is Valentine's Day, and we're doing a special presentation inspired by the amazing kiss that's in the current exhibit, talking about kisses in the archive. So you could sign up for that as well. Next month, we will be hosting Laura Helton as she talks about her book, Scattered and Fugitive Things, How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History. You will receive a reminder just as you did for this program, and then can choose to watch live or to wait for the email with the link. All right. And of course, if you're interested in sponsoring a bookworm or talking to me about any of those kinds of things, please feel free to reach out. Okay, so many good questions. I think actually we might want to just start with the first one. Kristen's asking if you saw any overlap between for-profit prisons and poorhouses and debtors' prisons.
Yeah, so it's complicated, like so many things. There was a lot of overlap in terms of the reformers who were circulating among all of these places. So the same people who were interested in prison reform were interested in poorhouses, were interested in workhouses. So they were connecting all of these things in their own work, and also I'll add insane asylums. They were thinking through all of these institutions that were arising in different ways in the 19th century and coming out of the 18th century. So in that way, yes. Also, what connected all of these things was that in all of these institutions, people were being forced to work in various ways. So workhouses, obviously, poorhouses, people were forced to work. But the work was, and also in all of these institutions, there were some people who believed that there should be social control, that there should be reformation, that people should be helped to live better lives. Not so much in the Auburn State Prison, but in other prisons. So yeah, there were all kinds of connections, but for me, what I really want to emphasize is the distinctions that coexisted with the connections. And what made the Auburn State Prison really different and radical was the idea that the institution itself should fundamentally exist for the purpose of turning a profit. And one thing that I didn't emphasize, but I should have earlier, is that this system spread. And it spread really hard, really fast, and everywhere. So it spread first throughout New York State. Other prisons were built on the same model. And then it spread throughout the Northeast. It spread to the South. It spread to the West. So the prisons in the South, both before and after the Civil War, that were using convict leasing, those prisons were imitating the Auburn State Prison. And this was explicit. They were talking about the Auburn system. They were using the Auburn system. So when we think about some of the most notorious prisons that many of us have heard of, when we think of, for example, San Quentin in California, or Parchman, or Angola, these prisons were all explicitly built on Auburn's model. So yes, there were important connections between the Auburn prison and prisons in general and workhouses and poorhouses, but there were also really important distinctions.
Yeah. So I think as you talked about the, for profit, one of the questions that Tom has is who exactly owned the prison? And,
Yeah.
so how did that income structure work?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. The answer is the state owned the prison. The state, this was always a state prison. This was never a private prison. And, one of the really important things I wanted to do in this book is stake a claim that a for-profit prison does not necessarily imply that it is a private prison. Now, I realize that that's a little bit of a controversial claim, but it's what I'm making. This is the hill I'm ready to die on. A lot of people equate a profit-driven prison with a private prison, which is a prison that is owned, a prison that is itself a corporation. That's a product of the late 20th century. There were no private prisons in the 19th century in the United States or anywhere else. But from my perspective, if you have a prison that has been established from the very beginning for the purpose of making a profit, and everything in the prison is designed for that purpose and functions for that purpose of making a profit, that's a for-profit prison. And that is the claim I'm making. So it was owned by the state. It was run by the state. But in reality, it was run by business. It was run by administrators. It was run by the state, but in a day-to-day way, it was run by administrators. And the administrators were political appointees, and they were pro-capitalism, and they were businessmen for the most part. And they were, most importantly, even when they themselves were not businessmen, they were serving businessmen. They were in dialogue with businessmen. They were collaborating with businessmen. And actually, the businessmen who ran the factories were in a lot of ways more powerful over the lives of prisoners than the wardens.
Wow. Um, so I think there is, you mentioned how they weren't allowed to speak in any way. And I noticed that we have several questions about the families of the prisoners. So I'm assuming that there's no visitation. Were they allowed to write letters? Were they communicating with their families in any way?
That is a great question. So first of all, there were a lot of different wardens over time. I mean, the prison existed from 1816 to today. So obviously there have been many different administrations, and the rules have changed from one administration to another, some of the rules, and some of the rules stayed stable. During William Freeman's day, there were some periods where no letters were permitted at all. And remember, William Freeman couldn't write. He could read, but he couldn't write. So he wouldn't have been able to send a letter anyway. But he was not permitted. Nobody was permitted at that time to send or receive letters. One thing that I did not talk about was that there was actually another revenue stream coming into the prison. And this is really horrific. The prison actually operated as, believe it or not, a tourist attraction. And tourists could pay 25 cents to enter the prison, and there were actually tunnels where the tourists could walk through these tunnels and peep out through peepholes at the spectacle of men working silently in factories. And there were also opportunities for tourists to go out of the tunnels and see and gawk at the prisoners in other circumstances. And many thousands of tourists entered the prison every year. And that's actually one of the best sources of information about the prison in this period. Going back to LaKisha's question about the research, because there were thousands of these tourists who entered the prison, and they wrote letters and they wrote diaries, and a lot of them are extant. So I have read so many unpublished letters and diaries of tourists who said, I went in and here's what I saw and here's what I did. So to get back to your question about family, during William Freeman's time, family was permitted to enter the prison as tourists. So they could pay 25 cents and enter the tunnels and enter the prison the same way as tourists, and the tourists and the families were not permitted to speak to the prisoners at all. And that actually happened with William Freeman's brother-in-law. William Freeman's brother-in-law, who loved him very much, entered the prison and saw William Freeman and observed him. And then later, when William Freeman was released, it was his brother-in-law, John, who came and picked him up.
Well, that kind of leads into this question. Someone's asking, they're wondering if you know when the concept of cruel and unusual punishment for the prison system was established, put in place, conceptualized.
In terms of that phrase, I don't know the origin of those actual familiar words. So I don't know the answer to that question. The question of what was cruel was very important to reformers during William Freeman's time. And they were constantly coming to the prison to assess whether the prison was, quote unquote, excessively cruel, whatever that means. So one of the arguments that I make in the book is that the parade of reformers coming to the prison and trying to assess whether the level of cruelty was too much, too little, or just right, actually just perpetuated the entire system. And one person who's really disappointing is Dorothea Dix, the reformer Dorothea Dix, who cared very much about prisons and about justice. She came to the prison and she wrote extensively about its use of waterboarding. And the prison was using waterboarding. It had invented a new form of waterboarding, which caused terrible debility and terrible maiming, and in some cases actually killed people. And Dorothea Dix's perspective was that this was great. Because it was less cruel than other forms of punishment. So the question of what is the right level of punishment, what is excessive cruelty, that was alive and well throughout the 19th century.
So speaking of reformers, Paul is asking about, he says, this is the period when the free produce movement against buying goods made with slave cultivated raw materials was gaining force. Was there a similar movement against buying goods produced in prisons?
Quick answer is no, not at all. The only organized resistance to labor in the Auburn State Prison and also elsewhere, because remember, the system spread really fast, really far. The only organized resistance to it came from white artisans who were manufacturing some of the same goods that were manufactured in the Auburn State Prison. So you had people, so for example, in the prison, they were manufacturing animal harnesses, for example, or furniture, or rugs, or shoes. And obviously, they were able to manufacture those goods for cheaper than free workers were able to. And so the non-incarcerated white workers in certain industries did organize against the use of forced prison labor, not because it was unjust, not because it was cruel, not because it was a form of slavery, but because it undercut their profits. So they did. They organized against it, and it took them over 70 years to get effective laws passed, not against forced prison labor, because that still exists, but against competition. So this is why in New York State today, license plates are made in the Auburn State Prison, and there's a vast manufacturing empire still in New York State and many other states where prisoners are manufacturing things like furniture. In the Auburn State, in the Auburn prison today, prisoners manufacture furniture as well as license plates. But they only manufacture things that are not competitive with other industries. So in New York State, nobody else is making license plates, so that's why there's no competition. And as for things like furniture, which obviously other people are making, the prisons in New York State only manufacture they only manufacture furniture for use in state institutions. So that's why when you go into a New York State school, for example, a public school, which I went to New York State public schools for my entire childhood, if you go into one of those schools and you sit on a chair, that chair was made by somebody in prison, almost certainly. Courthouses, the furniture in courthouses is made in prisons. And that's a direct result of the organizing of white artisans in New York State, starting in 1816 and going through 1884 was when they finally got effective legislation to outlaw not prison labor, not forced prison labor, but competition.
Interesting. And so I noticed that there are several other questions related to this idea of, what within the context of race are we seeing differences in the prison in Auburn? So you mentioned this idea of the prisoners being in solitary confinement, so they wouldn't need to be segregated at that point. But during Freeman's time, were they segregated for meals and while they were working?
Yeah, that's a great question. Short answer is no, not at all. And that's not because of anybody was anti-racist. It's certainly not for that reason. Black and white prisoners, and also Native American prisoners, of which there were a small number, were treated almost completely interchangeably. There was very close to what I would call exact equality. And that was not because anybody was anti-racist. The reason was that the prison itself was functioning like a factory. And in a factory, you want interchangeable parts. This was a modern factory where the parts are all interchangeable. And they wanted the people to be interchangeable. And they actually talked about this all the time, that they wanted the people to function like machines. And interchangeability was a key part of that. So there was a small number of work assignments within the prison that were racially based. The number one was actually barbering. All the barbers in the prison were Black. And I think the most likely reason for that is that it was barbering outside of prisons was largely a Black profession, not only, but largely. So the people who brought those skills into the prison were largely Black. But beyond that, work was distributed according to the principle of the goal was to extract as much labor as possible. And whatever body could, however labor could be extracted from a body, that was the goal. And that actually overrode racism within the prison. So yeah, it was a very strange situation where there was not segregation and there was a kind of equal opportunity exploitation, a terrible thing.
Right, right. Um, So I know we're getting low on time, but one of the questions Michael's asking that I think would be maybe interesting at this point too is, could you tell us just a little bit more about Freeman's life during and after the trial?
Sure, sure. So during the trial, William Freeman was incarcerated in a jail. So we've been talking about the Auburn State Prison, but there was also a county jail. And while he was awaiting trial and while he was under trial, being tried, he was in the county jail. And uh, as you might imagine, there was enormous anger against him, both because he had committed violence against white people, but also because he was challenging the economic engine of Auburn. And also, one thing that I talk about a lot in the book is how Auburn was not only the economic engine of the town of the city of Auburn, it was also a political seesaw for the entire New York state. Um, the political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, were actually fighting their battles through the Auburn State Prison, and it had an outsized effect on statewide elections. So this was hugely important. And when William Freeman challenged it, there was enormous anger against him. And the way the jail managed that anger was by putting him on display and allowing anybody to come into the jail. And so what they did is they lined up, and people actually came in from out of town. Thousands of people lined up outside the prison, outside the jail, to come in and stare at William Freeman in an 8 by 8 foot jail cell. And they came in and they screamed at him and they spat at him and they threw things at him. And that's what he endured during his trial. After the trial, I don't want to give away the end of the book, but after the trial, he did. I will say that his life was not easy after the trial. I will say that, and I will say that Auburn itself changed after his trial and became a center for Black organizing.
Um, I noticed that Marshall came in late and started to ask about prison reform, which we've talked a little bit more about, but also mentioned, that he was thinking license plates are made in Michigan in prisons, and that is true. So we've been focused on Auburn, but yes, there, just as we discussed briefly at the beginning of this program, many prisons around the country are indeed continuing unfair labor practices.
And that is a direct result of not just the Auburn prison, but the actual people who I introduce in this book. I mean, one of the reasons I hope people will read this book is that they will meet the actual individuals who came up with these ideas that are now ubiquitous. These people have names, these people have identities, and you will actually meet them in my book. So the fact that license plates are made in Michigan prisons is a direct result of the actions of the people in this book.
All right. So thank you so much for writing this book, for your amazing research, for this conversation today. And yeah, and I look forward to you coming to Michigan and holding his portrait. And thank you, everybody, for all of your good questions and comments and attention. And we really appreciate that as well. So have a
Thank you.
great.
Yeah, just thank you so much. Thank you for including me in this series. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.